Picture this. It's 1307, and England has just crowned its most controversial king. Edward II sits on the throne, but instead of focusing on ruling his kingdom, he's fixated on something, or rather someone else entirely. Within days of his coronation, he does something so shocking that it sends ripples of outrage through the entire English nobility. He elevates a commoner, a boy from humble origins, to become one of the most powerful earls in England. But this isn't just any political appointment. This is a love story so scandalous, so all-consuming, that it would ultimately bring down a king and reshape English history forever. The boy's name was Piers Gaveston, and what happened between him and Edward II was so extraordinary that chroniclers of the time struggled to find words for it. Some called Gaveston the king's brother. Others whispered he was his wife. But perhaps the most telling description came from those who said he had become the king's queen, wielding power and influence that surpassed even that of England's actual queen. This is the story of how a Gascon knight's son rose from obscurity to become the most hated man in England, how a king chose love over duty, and how their relationship would ignite a civil war that tore the kingdom apart. It's a tale of passion, politics, and ultimately tragedy. One that proves that sometimes the most powerful force in history isn't armies or gold, but the human heart. To understand how Piers Gaveston became the most influential person in England, we need to go back to where it all began. Not in the glittering halls of Westminster, but in the windswept borderlands between England and Scotland, where young men forged bonds that would last a lifetime. Piers Gaveston was born around 1284 in Gascony, the son of Sir Arnaud de Gaveston, a knight in service to Edward I. His father was what we might call middle management in the medieval world, important enough to serve the king but hardly nobility. When Piers was still a teenager, his father's loyal service earned him a remarkable opportunity. His son would be sent to England to serve as a companion to the future king, Edward II. Edward I, known as Longshanks for his imposing height, was a king who understood the importance of surrounding his heir with the right influences. The problem was, his son Edward was nothing like him. Where Edward I was a warrior king who had conquered Wales and nearly conquered Scotland, young Edward II was more interested in music, poetry, and the company of handsome young men than in warfare and statecraft. When Piers arrived at the English court around 1300, he was probably 16 years old, charming, athletic, and possessed of that particular charisma that some people seem born with. He and Prince Edward, who was about the same age, became instant companions. They trained together, fought together in the Scottish campaigns, and shared the intimate camaraderie that develops between young men facing danger side by side. But their relationship quickly became something more than friendship. Medieval chroniclers, writing with the careful language required when discussing royal scandals, described their bond in terms that left little doubt about its nature. They were, in the words of one contemporary writer, bound together in such love that Edward cherished Piers above all other mortals. Another chronicler noted that the prince loved him more than his own brothers. Edward I watched this relationship develop with growing alarm. As his son reached adulthood, it became clear that Piers Gaveston had become not just his favorite, but his obsession. The old king tried various strategies to break up the friendship. He sent Piers away from court, assigned him to distant military campaigns, and even arranged for his son to marry Isabella, the daughter of the French king. Nothing worked. Edward and Piers always found their way back to each other. The breaking point came in 1307, when Edward I discovered just how deep his son's attachment to Gaveston had become. In a fit of rage, the dying king banished Piers from England, threatening him with death if he ever returned. But Edward I's threats would soon become meaningless, because on July 7, 1307, the hammer of the Scots drew his last breath, and everything changed. The moment Edward II became king, one of his first acts was to recall Piers Gaveston from exile. This wasn't just the reunion of two friends. It was the beginning of one of the most scandalous royal relationships in English history. What Edward II did next was so unprecedented that it shocked even a medieval society accustomed to royal eccentricity. On August 6, 1307, less than a month after becoming king, Edward made Piers Gaveston the Earl of Cornwall, one of the most prestigious titles in England. To put this in perspective, the earldom of Cornwall traditionally went to members of the royal family. It came with vast lands, enormous wealth, and a status that placed its holder among the most powerful nobles in the kingdom. The English nobility were apoplectic. Here was a foreign upstart, the son of a minor Gascon knight, suddenly elevated to a position that placed him above earls whose families had served English kings for centuries. But Edward wasn't finished. He also granted Gaveston extensive lands in Ireland, made him his chief advisor, and gave him a level of access to the royal person that was typically reserved for queens. And that's exactly how Gaveston began to function, like a queen. He stood at Edward's right hand during state occasions, wore robes that rivaled the king's own in their magnificence, and displayed an arrogance that suggested he saw himself as Edward's equal rather than his subject. Contemporary accounts describe him as stunningly handsome, with a wit so sharp it could cut down his enemies with words alone. He gave mocking nicknames to the great earls of England, calling the Earl of Lancaster the Churl and the Earl of Pembroke Joseph the Jew, insults that these proud men would never forget or forgive. The relationship between Edward and Piers was conducted with an openness that scandalized medieval sensibilities. They shared everything: meals, bedchambers, hunts, and even jewelry. Edward showered his favorite with gifts that chroniclers described as more appropriate for a beloved wife than a male courtier. Piers wore the king's clothes, used his seal, and spoke with his authority. In practical terms, he had become the second most powerful person in England. But perhaps the most telling evidence of their relationship came during Edward's coronation. As tradition demanded, Edward had married Isabella of France in January 1308, and she was crowned alongside him as queen. However, throughout the coronation ceremony, observers noted that Edward's attention was not on his new bride, but on Piers Gaveston, who had been given a place of honor that traditionally belonged to members of the royal family. Isabella, who was only 12 years old at the time, reportedly wept during the ceremony. Whether from homesickness, fear, or the dawning realization that her husband's heart belonged to another, we'll never know. But her father, Philip IV of France, was furious when he heard reports of how his daughter had been treated. The sight of the English king paying more attention to his male favorite than to his new wife became one of the great scandals of medieval Europe. The earls and barons of England watched all this with growing fury. They had expected Edward II to be different from his father, but they hadn't expected him to completely overturn the natural order of things. In their view, Gaveston was not just the king's favorite. He was a usurper who had stolen the place that rightfully belonged to England's ancient nobility. The English nobility's patience finally snapped in 1308. Led by Edward's own cousin, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, they presented the king with an ultimatum: exile Piers Gaveston or face the consequences. These weren't empty threats. The barons controlled vast armies and could make England ungovernable if they chose to rebel. For perhaps the only time in his reign, Edward II chose political necessity over personal desire. In June 1308, he agreed to send Piers into exile, appointing him Lieutenant of Ireland, technically a promotion but effectively banishment. The parting scene between the two men was reported to be heartbreaking. They embraced publicly, exchanged rings, and made promises that their separation would be temporary. But if the barons thought that physical distance would cool the king's passion, they were badly mistaken. Edward's letters to Piers during this period reveal a man consumed by longing. He wrote constantly, sent gifts, and used every diplomatic channel available to ensure his favorite's comfort and safety in Ireland. Meanwhile, he began plotting Gaveston's return almost immediately. Piers, for his part, proved to be surprisingly effective as Lieutenant of Ireland. He organized successful military campaigns against Irish rebels, reformed the administration, and even increased revenues to the crown. These achievements gave Edward the excuse he needed to recall his favorite in 1309, arguing that Gaveston's success in Ireland proved his value as an administrator. The reunion was ecstatic. Edward showered Piers with new gifts, restored all his English lands, and made it clear that nothing had changed between them. If anything, their time apart seemed to have intensified their bond. They appeared together constantly, hunted together, and resumed their practice of sharing bedchambers and personal effects. The barons were livid, but they were also learning that dealing with Edward II required different tactics than those that had worked with previous kings. This king could not be intimidated by threats or swayed by appeals to duty. His love for Gaveston seemed to override every other consideration, including the welfare of his kingdom. In 1310, the barons tried a new approach. Instead of simply demanding Gaveston's exile, they forced Edward to accept the appointment of 21 ordainers, essentially a council of regency that would reform the government and limit royal power. The ordainers spent months drafting a comprehensive set of reforms known as the Ordinances, which addressed everything from financial reform to foreign policy. But the heart of the ordinances was a single, non-negotiable demand. Piers Gaveston must be permanently exiled from England, and Edward must swear never to recall him. Moreover, the ordinances declared that Gaveston was an enemy of the king and kingdom, and that anyone who aided him would be considered a traitor. Edward's reaction to these demands revealed the depth of his feelings for Gaveston. Rather than accept the loss of his favorite, he began secretly preparing for civil war. The events of 1311 and 1312 represent one of the most extraordinary episodes in English royal history. A king willing to fight his own nobility for the right to keep his male lover at his side. When the ordainers presented their final demands in August 1311, Edward agreed to exile Gaveston once more, but this time his compliance was purely strategic. Piers left England in November 1311, but he went only as far as Flanders, where he remained in secret communication with Edward. The king was already planning his favorite's return, and by Christmas 1311, those plans were put into action. Using his network of loyal supporters, Edward arranged for Gaveston to return to England in secret in January 1312. The reunion took place at York, and contemporary accounts suggest it was emotionally overwhelming for both men. They had been apart for only a few months, but the stress of separation and the constant threat of permanent exile had taken its toll. Edward reportedly wept when he saw Piers again, and they spent days in private before making any public appearances. When news of Gaveston's return reached the ordainers, their reaction was swift and furious. Thomas of Lancaster declared that the king had broken his solemn oath, and that Gaveston was now an outlaw who could be killed on sight. Other earls began mobilizing their armies, and by March 1312, England was on the brink of civil war. Edward's response was to make perhaps the most romantic and politically suicidal gesture of his entire reign. He publicly declared that the ordinances were illegal, that his oath to exile Gaveston had been extracted under duress, and that he would rather fight all of England than be parted from his beloved companion. He restored all of Gaveston's titles and lands, appointed him royal governor of several key castles, and made it clear that anyone who threatened Piers would answer to the king personally. This was more than a political crisis. It was a declaration that love trumped law, that personal devotion mattered more than the stability of the kingdom. Edward II had chosen Piers Gaveston over England itself. The civil war that followed was brief but decisive. The Earl's armies vastly outnumbered the forces loyal to Edward and Gaveston. By May 1312, the king and his favorite were on the run, moving from castle to castle as the rebel earls closed in on them. They spent their last weeks together at Scarborough Castle on the Yorkshire coast, a virtually impregnable fortress that seemed to offer them a final refuge. But even Scarborough couldn't protect them forever. The Earl of Lancaster's forces besieged the castle, and it quickly became clear that surrender was inevitable. In a final act of love and desperation, Edward managed to slip away from Scarborough in the early hours of May 19, 1312, leaving Gaveston behind with a promise that he would raise an army and return to rescue him. It was the last time they would ever see each other alive. Piers Gaveston's final weeks at Scarborough Castle reveal a man who had finally grasped the full consequences of his relationship with Edward II. Contemporary accounts suggest that he spent much of his time writing letters to the king, arrangements for his financial affairs, and what may have been a personal testament that has since been lost to history. On May 19, 1312, with food running low and no hope of relief, Gaveston negotiated a surrender with Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, the same man he had mockingly nicknamed Joseph the Jew. The terms seemed reasonable. Gaveston would surrender himself to Pembroke's custody and would be taken to York for trial before the full Parliament. Pembroke gave his word as a nobleman that Gaveston would be treated with honor and protected from harm. But Thomas of Lancaster had other plans. Lancaster was Edward's cousin, one of the most powerful earls in England, and a man who had been personally insulted by Gaveston's mockery. More importantly, he understood that as long as Gaveston lived, Edward would never truly accept the authority of the Ordainers. The only solution was permanent. On June 9, 1312, while Pembroke was away from his escort, Lancaster's men surrounded Gaveston's party and seized the prisoner. They took him to Warwick Castle, where Lancaster and several other earls had gathered to decide his fate. The trial, if it can be called that, was brief and predetermined. Gaveston was declared guilty of treason and sentenced to immediate execution. What happened next became one of the most notorious episodes in medieval English history. On June 19, 1312, Gaveston was taken to Blacklow Hill, a desolate spot on the road between Warwick and Coventry. There, before a small crowd of nobles and soldiers, the man who had once been called the King's Queen was forced to kneel on the muddy ground. The execution was deliberately brutal. Instead of the quick death by sword that would have been appropriate for a nobleman, Gaveston was killed by common soldiers using weapons more suited to executing peasants. Some accounts suggest he was stabbed repeatedly before being beheaded. Others claim he was tortured before being killed. What's certain is that his death was meant to send a message. This is what happens to upstart foreigners who dare to rise above their station. But perhaps the most poignant detail of Gaveston's execution comes from the chronicles that describe his final moments. According to several accounts, his last words were not a plea for mercy or a curse upon his enemies, but a message for Edward. "Tell the king I died loving him above all earthly things." When news of Gaveston's death reached Edward II, the king's reaction was reported to be unlike anything his courtiers had ever witnessed. He collapsed, wept openly, and remained in seclusion for days. When he finally emerged, those who knew him said he had been fundamentally changed. The passionate, impulsive young man had been replaced by someone harder, more calculating, and consumed by a desire for revenge. Edward had Gaveston's body recovered and brought to King's Langley, where it was embalmed and kept in state for months while the king planned an elaborate funeral. The ceremony, when it finally took place in December 1312, was more magnificent than many royal funerals, with Edward sparing no expense to honor his dead beloved. The death of Piers Gaveston marked a turning point not just in Edward II's reign, but in English history itself. The relationship between the king and his favorite had exposed fundamental tensions in medieval society about power, sexuality, and the nature of kingship that would reverberate for generations. In the immediate aftermath of Gaveston's execution, Edward II's transformation was remarkable. The king, who had once been dismissed as weak and ineffective, suddenly displayed a ruthless efficiency in pursuing his enemies. He spent the next few years methodically rebuilding his power base, exploiting divisions among the nobility, and preparing for revenge against those who had killed his beloved. Edward's opportunity came in 1322, when Thomas of Lancaster overreached himself and gave the king cause to move against him. The civil war that followed was brief but decisive. At the Battle of Boroughbridge, Lancaster's forces were crushed, and the Earl himself was captured. Edward's revenge was swift and brutal. Lancaster was tried for treason and executed in the same manner as Gaveston, on a muddy hillside before a jeering crowd. But victory could not fill the void that Gaveston's death had left in Edward's heart. The king began a desperate search for a replacement, someone who could occupy the place that Piers had held in his affections. He found it in Hugh Despenser the Younger, another handsome young nobleman who became Edward's new favorite. But while the relationship with Despenser was politically significant, contemporaries noted that it lacked the genuine passion that had characterized Edward's bond with Gaveston. The parallels between Gaveston and Despenser were striking, but so were the differences. Where Gaveston had been charming and witty, Despenser was calculating and cruel. Where Gaveston's greatest fault had been arrogance, Despenser was actively malicious, using his influence with the king to destroy his enemies and enrich himself. Most tellingly, while Edward had been willing to fight all of England for Gaveston, his attachment to Despenser, though strong, never reached the same level of all-consuming devotion. The reign of Edward II would end in disaster. His relationship with Despenser proved even more unpopular than his love for Gaveston, leading to another civil war in which his own wife, Isabella, took up arms against him. In 1327, Edward was forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son, and shortly afterward, he died in mysterious circumstances at Berkeley Castle, possibly murdered on the orders of his enemies. But the story of Edward and Gaveston had already entered the realm of legend. Medieval chroniclers struggled to categorize their relationship, using language that ranged from romantic to explicitly sexual. Some described Gaveston as Edward's beloved, others as his concubine, and still others simply as the person the king loved beyond measure and reason. The relationship between Edward II and Piers Gaveston has fascinated historians, writers, and artists for more than 7 centuries. Their story raises profound questions about love, power, and identity that remain relevant today. In an age when royal marriages were political arrangements and personal feelings were considered secondary to dynastic duty, Edward and Piers dared to prioritize their emotional bond over the expectations of their society. The title, "The Boy Who Became a Queen," captures something essential about Gaveston's role in Edward's life and reign. In practical terms, Piers wielded the kind of influence typically associated with royal wives. He stood at the king's right hand during ceremonies, managed access to the royal presence, and enjoyed a level of intimacy with the monarch that was usually reserved for queens. More symbolically, he occupied the emotional space in Edward's heart that should have belonged to Isabella of France. Modern historians have debated the exact nature of Edward and Gaveston's relationship for decades. Some argue that the intense language used by medieval chroniclers reflected the literary conventions of the time rather than literal descriptions of sexual activity. Others point to the unprecedented nature of Edward's devotion to Gaveston as evidence that their bond went beyond mere friendship or even standard medieval relationships between lords and favorites. What seems undeniable is that Edward II's love for Piers Gaveston was genuinely transformative, for both men and for the kingdom they inhabited. Gaveston rose from relative obscurity to become one of the most powerful men in England, wielding an influence that his birth and background could never have secured through conventional means. Edward, meanwhile, discovered that his capacity for love was so great that it could override every other consideration, including his duty as king. The tragedy of their story lies not just in its violent conclusion, but in its fundamental impossibility. Medieval society had no place for the kind of relationship Edward and Gaveston shared. There were no models for a king who loved a man more than his wife, no precedents for a favorite who functioned as a royal consort, no language to describe what they meant to each other that wouldn't scandalize or condemn. Their story also illuminates the constraints and contradictions of medieval masculinity. Edward II was expected to be a warrior king like his father, but his interests lay elsewhere. He was supposed to father heirs and maintain dynasty, but his heart belonged to a man. He was meant to embody the ideal of medieval kingship, but his greatest joy came from the private moments he shared with his beloved companion. The nobles who opposed Edward and Gaveston saw themselves as defending tradition and proper order. From their perspective, the king's obsession with his favorite threatened the very foundations of medieval society. A king who could be swayed by love rather than guided by duty was a dangerous precedent. A foreigner who could rise to the highest positions through royal favor rather than birth or service undermined the entire social hierarchy. Yet there's something undeniably moving about Edward's willingness to risk everything for love. In an age of arranged marriages and political alliances, he chose authentic emotion over dynastic convenience. In a society that prized military prowess and territorial expansion, he valued personal relationships above conquest. In a world where kings were expected to subordinate their private feelings to public duty, he dared to insist that love mattered more than law. The story of Edward II and Piers Gaveston is ultimately a story about the power of human connection to transcend social boundaries and transform lives. In the space of just 5 years, a minor Gascon nobleman's son became one of the most influential people in England, while a king discovered that his capacity for love was so great it could reshape his understanding of duty, honor, and power. Their relationship challenged every assumption about medieval society. It suggested that authentic emotion could be more powerful than political calculation, that personal bonds could matter more than social hierarchy, and that love, even forbidden love, could be worth any sacrifice. These were radical ideas in the 14th century, and they remain compelling today. But their story is also a tragedy, a reminder of the costs that society imposes on those who dare to love outside its approved boundaries. Gaveston paid for his elevation with his life, dying violently at the hands of men who saw him as a threat to natural order. Edward paid for his love with his kingdom, his crown, and ultimately his life. Their relationship, which began with such joy and promise, ended in bloodshed and despair. Yet even in tragedy, there's something triumphant about their story. For a brief, shining moment, Edward and Piers proved that love could conquer convention, that two people could create their own definitions of devotion and loyalty, and that the human heart was capable of feeling so deeply that it could change the course of history. The boy who became a queen for the King of England left behind more than just a scandalous legend. Piers Gaveston and Edward II relationship opened conversations about love, power, and identity that continue to this day. They showed that even in the most restrictive societies, human beings will find ways to express their authentic selves and connect with those they love. Their story reminds us that behind the grand narratives of medieval history, the wars, the politics, the rise and fall of dynasties, there were real people with real emotions, struggling to find happiness and meaning in a world that often seemed designed to prevent both. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of all. That love, in all its forms, has always been and will always be one of the most powerful forces in human history. The boy who became a queen for the King of England died on a muddy hill in Warwickshire more than 700 years ago. But the love he shared with Edward II, passionate, destructive, transformative, and utterly human, continues to resonate across the centuries, reminding us that some bonds are so powerful they can reshape not just individual lives, but the course of history itself. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, share and comment below. See you in the next one.